So in this video, you may ask me, what does this have to do with digestion? So our topic is on the acidic stomach. And let's just look at the three sections here. One, two, three. Let's go back. One, two, three. So we have a pH of 1 to 2 here, which is the stomach, the acidic stomach, right? Then we have the small intestine, the main part where digestion takes place and things leave your outside external bodies and go to the blood system, basically through the portal vein to the liver, then to the blood system. And then we have the third part, which does some other stuff, fermentation being one of them, and also the whole idea of creating that which was not created, which should be inputted, things like butyrate, arsenic, propionate. If you give them fiber, the little microorganisms could convert. And then, of course, this part here is really absorb water, expel stuff, pass it out. Okay. So our goal is one and two. Here, really and truly, is just back up and pass out stuff. Now, when we say number one is acidic, number two is not acidic. We know number one is supposed to be very acidic for the digestion of certain substrates. Substrates being meat, fish, eggs, um, those things that needs acid to bring them to a certain state of proper soaking, and that soaking would lead to the denaturing of the meat protein to uncoil it to make it straight. Pepsin wake up, B12 wake up, with the intrinsic factor wake up to get to uncleave the B12 from the meat and stuff like that. With the small intestine, which is a secondary support process for meat eaters, but with the non-meat eaters, plant-based eaters, they don't have much use of the stomach. So what happens? Stuff goes into the stomach, it gets sterilized if you have good stomach acid. And generally, if you are on a plant-based diet, which is a high carb diet, your stomach acidity level goes to 3 or 4 naturally, because you are not calling upon the gastrin to release the gastric acid juices. So you start over time realizing you have this burping and reflux. Basically, throwing some hydrochloric acid to support your meal time, or things like apple cider vinegar, anything that is acidic in nature would help the stomach to kind of remember what it's supposed to do. But nevertheless, carbohydrates tries to come to the small intestine and take its time. Does not mean it takes its time, but it goes through this 20 feet of small intestine, which would then pull out all the glucose and vitamin C and whatever else it has up to the liver for due diligence. Now, in our program, which is the TRIO protocol, we recommend that we see the whole ability of feeding from the concept of the end and not from the beginning. We start from the end, which is there are cells in your body, in every tissue, every organ has many, many thousands, millions of cells. These cells are looking for specific substrate to feed the active organelles, which is the little guy who resides in the cells. So there are many organelles in a cell. In the day, the organelle that is resident and active is the mitochondria, and therefore, in the day when you eat plants or you eat sources of glucose and they digest and they bring glucose into the blood, the glucose gets absorbed or used by the mitochondria that is inside the cell, because the mitochondria is alive, and so they could consume glucose into ATP. However, when you drift into the evening and you start becoming less active, then the mitochondria itself is becoming less active. Into the night, they become more and more into a state of sleep. And when that happens, you are now to understand why you don't want to eat plants in the evening to the night, because you would be just having glucose like this little thing here with the golden icons. That's the glucose. You would have so much glucose just floating in the blood, and that glucose leads to things like advanced glycation end product and many other issues. We know that the liver would have to take care of the glucose eventually, but the goal is to reduce as much glucose in your pipes when you are in a state of rest. On the other hand, reducing glucose also calls on the need for increasing amino acids, fatty acids, and other vitamins and minerals, which could be represented by the blues, to get these amino acids into the same cells who now have the active organelles like ribosomes who would take instruction mRNA from the nucleus and from the DNA to make the protein that would heal you when you go to sleep. So having this concept means that you have a very clear idea as to why you are doing what you're doing. So in today's video, we are going to look at these three parts here: the acidic stomach with valve 1 and valve 2, and make a supposition at this point in time so that we become a little bit more at least alert and test ourselves when we are in a consumption mode. The rule of Moses says, eat your plants in the day, mean eat plant based in the day, eat your plants in the day. Why? Because you are supplying glucose. So what happens when glucose gets supplied? The mitochondria they are active in the day, so they could consume glucose molecules and convert it into ATP. If you look at the video from yesterday, you look at the bank run. You have a queue in the bank, descent line. One person is the mitochondria. They call them, the name is the teller. The teller could deal with one person in an orderly fashion. When you have this long queue, then you have a challenge with glucose molecules. That queue happens because you have glucose in your body in the night, which leads to AGE and stuff like that. However, we are looking at the stomach here, and when you look at the stomach, the acidic stomach is not for glucose creation, it is for the digestion of meats. Therefore, you have to ask yourself from top to bottom, what is really going on here? And then you start realizing, so if we have such a stomach designed to acidify the food, keep the food inside there for 3 to 4 hours so that it becomes well uncoiled or well denatured or whatever the word is, and pepsin wakes up and cut it up into smaller polypeptides and dipeptides and tripeptides to send it down lower into the small intestine so that it could be really made into amino acids by the enzymes and then absorb up to the liver. You start asking yourself, so how critical is that for us to understand and then apply this into our real world, which is basically saying to us, find sources of amino acids, meats, and stuff like that. But we also have to ask ourselves the question, if carbohydrates does not want to stay inside the acidic stomach, it does not want to stay there because it wants to get to the small intestine, then what is important for us to understand when it comes to the small intestine for carbohydrates, and what is important for us to understand about that stomach for carbohydrates? So according to the research paper, which I should pull up and show, I can't show here, but I would have to pull up and show. The research papers are showing that consumption of carbohydrates 6 or 7 days in a row without having adequate fats and protein somewhere in and in between leads to your stomach acidity losing its natural 1 and 2 pH to go to 3 and 4, which is not a good sign. Because remember, when your pH gets to 3 and 4, that is when things like H. pylori and other external bacteria could actually survive in the no not so acidic stomach, make their way there and start going down that way. That's a challenge, and that challenge has to be understood from the positioning of the acidic stomach. Why does the acidic stomach sit at the top? Well, it's your gate of entrance into your small intestine. It protects the small intestine from that same parasitic things coming in and not having the ability to survive in acid, so they die. But when you tame it down and you use carbohydrates in such a long period of time without infusing there with some HCl or some good fats or proteins, then that keeps the acid level 3 and 4, sometimes 5, and that is where the weakness is created. I hope you got an idea of what we need to do when it comes to even those who are eating plant based. When you are eating plant based, you have to be cognizant of the facts that stands out in our design, that we have an acidic stomach. So we would push now to say, if we are eating plants, we could now acidify with supplementation, such as the limes, the lemons, the apple cider vinegar, the biting HCI or HCl, which you could buy, and other sort of stuff like that. Or we would include proper fats like your coconut oil, your olive oils, or whatever other fats if you're eating plant-based into your meal first. In food, first thing placed in your meal would be the fats, because it is known by science that fat triggers the production of acid, and that helps save our small intestine, because the acidic stomach could now become acidic Yes, it would not hold the plant for too long because it is carbohydrates they want to get out, but at least it would create a wash of acid with the right pH of 1, 2, 2.5, which would sterilize the food substance that are placed in the mouth that came to this acidic stomach, and then it would eventually 20, 30 minutes after it goes into the small intestine. Now, it's important to understand fats here, as we do not understand the intricacies of fats in this whole process. Notice I did not say if you are eating some protein, but I noted that if we are eating substances that contain fats, so if you are a plant-based, you are a plant-based eater, you do not want to eat your, let's say, your lentil peas soup or your quinoa without having adequate fats. You want to put adequate amount of fats, whether it's your avocado or your nuts, in that meal to trigger the creation of that hormone called CCK, so that it would at least release some, it would release somewhat bile from the gallbladder in conjunction to the bolus of food that comes from that valve 2. You see valve 2 here goes, it's the lower, it's the pyloric splinter if it's spelled correctly, but it has goes to the duodenum where the bile comes in from a little pipe called the I think the splinter of Odie or something like that from the gallbladder. Now, to get the gallbladder to release, you have to put in something of a nature fats. And so it is important for us to follow up with this with whatever plant-based meal. So the plant-based meal by itself, while it may have some protein, while it may have some a lot of glucose for sure, vitamin C, you have to be conscious that it may not come with a lot of fats. And therefore, if you don't put fats with it, if you don't add your coconut oil or whatever other fat based substance you could find in your home, if you don't add those things in that mixture, you would not be having a proper digestion, because when the carbohydrates leave the stomach in 30 minutes, it still needs to get a little bit of bile. It would not be acidic, and you have to understand how the designer designed this thing. If it is carbohydrates you are eating by itself, the acid levels would go right up to pH 5 or 6. The reason that of course that is dangerous from a sterilization and protection point of view, but the reason why that happens, if you eat carbohydrates, you do not have a natural way to tame down the acid from the stomach. So one, the stomach would not hold carbohydrates, so it would release it quickly. Two, the stomach would calm down from making strong acid for carbohydrates. It would not be generating pH 1 and 2 acid, because it knows that there isn't anything to tame the acid down lower on. And that is a very on the discussed point. A carbohydrate or a plant-based diet causes the gallbladder to little trickle, if ever, of the amount of bile that would be released. So putting a fat with the carbohydrate causes bile to release, and that would cause your, when your pyloric splinter opens and it releases one bolus of food comes out and goes into the duodenum. The bile comes down because the signal was sent up to the bile from the fats in the food or the oils in the food, send up a signal to your gallbladder to say squeeze, CCK, squeeze the gallbladder. The hormone caused the squeezing of the gallbladder, and so one time you have your gallbladder coming to calm down the acid. Yes, it's coming down to emulsify the fat, but it's coming also to calm down the acid, because it has to come with a way to tame it down. Of course, the gastric juices are also coming across with some bile-based substances to calm down the acid so it wouldn't burn you. But the combination of both of them is quite important. So having fats with this, so if you're having a quinoa bowl or whatever, some other soups made from peas, you would notice we have naturally been cooking with coconuts in those things, which would give the fat content and make the digestion process quite capable in the human body. Thank you for viewing, and we look forward to see you in the next one.